The catastrophe hook and foundation. For millions of Americans, the last 4 years were defined by a single, exhilarating belief: real estate never goes down. It was a mantra whispered at family barbecues, shouted in online forums, and backed by the kind of astronomical price growth that felt permanent, immutable, and like a guarantee of generational wealth. Every refinance, every equity withdrawal, every surging property tax assessment felt like a validation. We were living through the golden age of American homeownership, a time when a simple starter home gained more value in a year than most people earned in 2. But what if I told you that the music has finally stopped? What if the guarantee has expired? Right now, a quiet panic is gripping the most overheated housing markets in the United States, a panic rooted in the brutal, simple mathematics of a market that has become structurally unsustainable. We are not talking about a slight correction or a gentle flattening of the curve. We are talking about a full-blown financial reset, a home price catastrophe. And today, we are going to expose the 10 major U.S. cities where the average homeowner is facing a guaranteed, 6-figure loss of equity, a $100,000 drop, by the end of 2026. This is the story of expectation meeting reality, the collision of optimism with crippling high interest rates, and the brutal unraveling of the great pandemic boom. If your home is in one of these 10 cities, or if you are considering moving to one, the information we are about to share is critical. It will force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about your biggest investment. This channel is not here to sell you on the next hot stock or the next great investment opportunity. We are here to arm you with the data that exposes the flaws in the system and prepares you for the financial storm that is already gathering. The competition wants you to believe that the market is either on an unstoppable climb or that the coming correction will be a gentle, national event. That is the first lie we have to dismantle. The housing market is no longer a single, cohesive entity. It is a mosaic of micromarkets, and the coming pain is going to be hyperlocalized and viciously targeted at the very places that saw the most extreme, unchecked growth. We are looking for the Achilles heel cities, the markets where prices rose so far past local wages, where the reliance on external capital and remote worker migration was so complete that the moment the economic tide turned, their structural integrity collapsed. To understand a $100,000 drop, you have to understand the price mechanics. This is not just a high percentage decline, it is the absolute dollar loss that changes lives, triggers foreclosures, and pushes millions of Americans into a negative equity position. A $100,000 loss on a $300,000 house is a crisis. A $100,000 loss on a $700,000 house is a certainty in these environments. The key difference between this crash and the 2008 crisis is the source of the shock. In 2008, the crash was caused by bad loans to bad borrowers. This time, the crash is being triggered by interest rates that have created an impenetrable affordability wall for new buyers, combined with a tidal wave of inventory that is slowly being unleashed by the very people who are supposed to be the bedrock of the market, the long-term, low-rate homeowners. Let's begin by setting the stage for the inevitability of this decline. We must first discuss the single greatest driver of this coming catastrophe, the mortgage lock-in effect and its inevitable, painful conclusion. For years, the market has been artificially supported by the vast majority of homeowners who locked in a mortgage rate below 4%. They have no incentive to move, creating an unprecedented supply drought that kept prices high, even with low transaction volume. This phenomenon has been framed as a sign of market strength. It is, in fact, the greatest systemic weakness. What happens when that low-rate homeowner has a divorce, a job loss, a medical emergency, or needs to move for an aging parent? They are forced to sell their low-rate home and buy a new one at a high rate, immediately taking a huge financial hit. Until now, these have been isolated incidents. But the pressure points, job instability in the tech sector, massive property tax hikes, a surge in insurance costs, and the sunsetting of various pandemic-era financial lifelines are creating millions of individual tipping points. The trickle of forced sellers is rapidly turning into a torrent. When that torrent hits the market, who is left to buy? The answer, almost no one, because the same high interest rates that locked sellers in have simultaneously locked buyers out. This is the devastating contrast that guarantees the $100,000 drop in these vulnerable markets. The collapse will be defined by three converging forces that our competitors refuse to fully acknowledge. The first is oversupply from investor capitulation. The rental market is already in a painful spiral, as we have seen in markets like Phoenix and Austin. Investors who bought single-family homes at peak pricing to use as rentals are now drowning in negative cash flow, crushed by rising property taxes, high insurance costs, and collapsing rents fueled by rampant apartment construction. When these institutional and retail investors decide to cut their losses, which they are doing right now, they flood the market with inventory that is priced to move, setting new, lower comps and driving down the value of surrounding owner-occupied homes. The second force is the wealth gap erosion. The most egregious price growth occurred in high-end, affluent, and desirable metro areas, places where prices were already far out of reach for median-income workers. These markets, which require the highest monthly payments, are the most sensitive to interest rate hikes. Every quarter-point hike hits a $1 million home purchase far harder than a $500,000 purchase, accelerating the erosion of the potential buyer pool. The third, and most chilling force, is the psychological domino effect. Real estate confidence, much like a bank run, is driven by collective belief. When a few neighbors sell their homes for $100,000 less than the recent peak, it shatters the confidence of every homeowner on that street. They realize the market value is no longer what Zillow told them, it is what the last sale dictates. This panic triggers a race to the bottom, where sellers compete on price to beat the next wave of inventory. This is the dynamic that transforms a correction into a catastrophe. We are entering a period where the traditional rules of real estate are inverted. Instead of fearing missing out on rising prices, FOMO, the market will be driven by the fear of being left behind with the highest-priced, least liquid asset, FOLOP, fear of losing out on selling price. The cities we are about to detail are the epicenters of this shift. They are the beautiful, desirable, booming markets that have been living on borrowed time and borrowed optimism. They have the highest debt-to-equity ratios for new buyers, the most exposure to volatile job markets, tech, finance, and the least amount of resistance to a supply shock. These are the places where a 15% price drop translates directly to a six-figure loss, wiping out the entire down payment and equity gains for anyone who bought in the last 3 years. Prepare yourself, because we are about to begin the countdown. The countdown begins, cities number 10 through number 7. The structural failure we just discussed, the collision of high interest rates with a tidal wave of supply, is not a theoretical model. It is a live-action, destructive force playing out across America's most expensive real estate zip codes. We must shift now from the theory of the collapse to the practical, painful reality of the cities leading the way down. This is the moment to look past the glossy brochures and the endless, self-serving optimism of the real estate industry. We are starting our countdown at number 10, the city that first built its boom on a promise of endless sunshine and endless demand, only to discover that its foundation was made of sand. Number 10. San Diego, California. The narrative here was simple: paradise is expensive, but worth it. San Diego commanded an outrageous premium, driven by the California dream, a robust biotech industry, and an enviable coastal lifestyle. The average price for a single-family home here soared past the $900,000 mark, making the $100,000 loss we predict a devastating, but mathematically achievable, 11% correction. Why San Diego? Because the very people who fueled its spectacular rise, the high-salaried tech workers and remote professionals, are now the same people executing the silent exodus. Unlike the traditional housing downturns, this is not about job loss in the traditional sense, it's about locational arbitrage. Why pay $1.1 million for a cramped home in La Jolla when you can command the same salary working remotely from a $500,000 palace in the Mountain West? The demand for those million-dollar starter homes has evaporated, leaving a massive, expensive void. Inventory in the $1 million to $2 million range has surged over 70% in the last year, a stark contrast to the near-zero inventory of the boom years. Sellers who were once confident they could command an easy bidding war are now sitting on their properties for 60, 90, even 120 days. Each price cut, each failed closing, strips hundreds of thousands of dollars in perceived value from the neighborhoods around it. San Diego's problem is one of extreme overvaluation compounded by a lack of desperation. Sellers don't have to sell, so they wait, and that waiting simply drives down the psychological baseline for the entire market, ensuring that when the forced sales inevitably arrive, they will set a catastrophic new low. The $100,000 drop in San Diego isn't a forecast of doom, it's a necessary rebalancing that will punish those who bought at the peak of the remote work hysteria. Moving north, we find the same destructive dynamic, but amplified by massive corporate instability. This brings us to number 9, Seattle, Washington. Seattle was the epicenter of the tech boom, the city that literally built its skylines on the fortunes of Amazon, Microsoft, and the endless stream of venture capital flowing into its Puget Sound arteries. The average home price here pushed aggressively into the high six figures, making the $100,000 drop a painful but necessary correction that exposes the fragility of a one-industry town. The story of Seattle's collapse is the story of the great tech rationalization. Layoffs, hiring freezes, and the painful pivot back to profitability have shattered the myth of infinite wage growth. When Amazon pauses its corporate real estate deals and thousands of highly paid engineers are suddenly looking for work, the entire housing ecosystem freezes. But here is the brutal contrast. While the high-end job market is freezing, the new supply pipeline is not. Developers who started luxury apartment towers years ago are now delivering those units into a ghost town of demand. We are seeing concessions in the rental market, 2 months free, 0 deposit, that translate directly into depressed demand for home buying. Why rush to buy a $950,000 townhome when you can rent a brand new luxury apartment for a substantial discount? Seattle's vulnerability is compounded by the fact that the median price required to lose $100,000 is one of the lowest among our top 10 cities, meaning a comparatively small percentage drop translates to massive absolute loss. The city that was defined by wealth and expansion is now being defined by retrenchment and contraction. The six-figure loss is not just equity, it's the cost of betting entirely on the longevity of a speculative tech economy. Our countdown continues into the Sunbelt, a region that was supposed to be recession-proof, fueled by boundless migration and cheap land. This illusion brings us to number 8, Phoenix, Arizona. If San Diego and Seattle are suffering from a demand shock, Phoenix is suffering from a devastating supply and investor glut shock. Phoenix was the poster child for the institutional investor gold rush. Wall Street firms, rental funds, and amateur landlords bought up entire subdivisions, convinced that the desert climate and low property taxes guaranteed an unstoppable stream of renters. The narrative was that the supply could never keep up with the inflow. This was demonstrably false. Developers, incentivized by the same cheap land and investor demand, built at a pace the market simply could not sustain. Now, new construction homes, not just apartments, but finished single-family houses, are sitting unsold for 90, 120, even 150 days. This creates a vicious cycle. The institutional investors who wanted to rent out their purchases can't find tenants because the new apartment buildings are offering massive concessions. They can't sell their homes because the builders are slashing prices on brand new inventory just to clear their books. The average homeowner in Phoenix is caught in the crossfire between desperate builders and panicked investors. The result is a pricing war that quickly strips away perceived equity. For a city where the median home price surged past $450,000 during the peak, the predicted $100,000 correction is a gut punch, representing a loss of over 20% of peak valuation. The contrast here is palpable. The boom was built on the confidence of the biggest money. The bust is being engineered by the desperation of that same money. They will be the first to cut prices deep to protect their balance sheets, and their price cuts will be the comps that destroy the value of every neighborhood. The desert is officially littered with the wreckage of over-leveraged bets. Finally, we head to a city that built its boom not just on sunshine, but on a complete misunderstanding of its own economic fundamentals. This is number 7, Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh and the surrounding Research Triangle Park market represented the promise of the next great American metro: educated workforce, low density, and high quality of life. The narrative was irresistible, attracting thousands of new residents and investors who drove up the median home price to levels that simply do not align with the local wage base. Raleigh's collapse is rooted in the affordability backlash. The city priced itself out of its own market. The people who make Raleigh function, the mid-level engineers, the educators, the healthcare professionals, can no longer afford to buy a home there. The buying pool has shrunk to only the highest earners, and that pool is now exhausted. Data shows that the rapid collapse of migration into the area compared to the 2021-2022 peak has left a massive hole in demand. The homes are still coming online, and the sellers still expect pandemic-era bidding wars. They are receiving silence. The $100,000 loss here is a necessity to bring pricing back into a rational relationship with local incomes, but for anyone who bought a home in Raleigh or Cary in the last 2 years, that $100,000 loss is their entire down payment and any equity they may have built. The boom was fast. The collapse will be faster, exposing the truth that a great college town with a handful of tech jobs does not, in fact, equate to a recession-proof real estate mecca. The relentless momentum of the last 4 years is now officially in reverse. The fear of being the last seller to hold out is replacing the fear of missing out entirely. The mid-market collapse, cities number 6 through number 3. We have examined the coastal exodus markets of San Diego and Seattle, and the investor glut time bombs of Phoenix and Raleigh. The next segment of our countdown focuses on cities that represent a different kind of financial trap: the high-altitude, high-cost Mountain West hubs and the traditional East Coast powerhouses whose stability has been utterly compromised by soaring overhead and failing infrastructure. The narrative is shifting from demand disappeared to costs crush the profit margin, trapping sellers and paralyzing buyers. This next wave of cities, where the $100,000 equity loss is now imminent, proves that no region, no matter how desirable its scenery, is immune from the brutal arithmetic of an over-leveraged and overvalued market. Our journey continues to the Rocky Mountains for number 6, Denver, Colorado. For years, Denver was the darling of the Mountain West, selling a lifestyle built on sunshine, proximity to the ski slopes, and a booming, highly paid transplant community. The narrative sold was that the high prices were merely a lifestyle tax, you pay a premium for perfection. What buyers were not told is that the underlying fundamentals were decaying. Denver's collapse is fundamentally about the overbuilding conundrum intersecting with the rate hike shock. Developers, convinced the gold rush would last forever, delivered a staggering pipeline of new inventory, primarily mid-rise apartments and luxury towers, that now saturates the urban core from Highland to Cherry Creek. When that supply hit the market, demand had already peaked, largely because the very people capable of affording a $750,000 Denver home were locked out by high mortgage rates. The contrast is devastating. The city expected new high-income transplants. Instead, it received a glut of empty, brand-new units competing aggressively with older, existing inventory. Homeowners who bought duplexes and single-family rentals in 2021 with variable or short-term fixed loans are now seeing their debt service double as rates reset, precisely as their rental income is being undercut by apartment buildings offering 6 weeks of free rent. They are caught in a painful, inescapable squeeze. Unable to refinance due to stricter lending standards and declining home valuations, these sellers will be forced to dump properties at massive discounts, setting off the $100,000 correction and eroding the illusion of stability across the entire metro area. Just down the I-80 corridor, we find a similar but more insidious form of collapse at number 5, Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City and the surrounding Wasatch Front represented the perfect, smaller-scale pandemic boom. Low taxes, family values, and a burgeoning tech scene fueled a price surge that was disproportionate to the region's overall economic size. The city's collapse is rooted in the extreme local affordability crisis. The median home price required to afford a home in Salt Lake City surged so high that the percentage of local median income required for a mortgage payment is now over 55%, an unsustainable, crippling figure that prices out nearly the entire local workforce. Unlike the coastal cities, which can still rely on ultra-high net worth buyers, Salt Lake City ran out of new high-wage transplants capable of supporting its inflated prices. The market is now completely reliant on the thin, exhausted air of local demand. This is the definition of a pricing vacuum. Sellers are holding on to fantasy prices, refusing to accept the reality that the buyer pool has evaporated. The only way to re-engage the market is through massive price capitulation. The $100,000 drop here will not be gradual. It will be a sharp, necessary shock, as the few remaining buyers cherry-pick the deepest discounts, forcing every other seller to follow suit. This financial reckoning will wipe out the entire equity position of thousands of new homeowners, proving that a great quality of life cannot compensate for fundamentally broken housing math. Now we turn to a market that built its reputation on boundless space and economic dynamism, only to find itself betrayed by aggressive lending and unchecked development. This is number 4, Dallas, Texas. Dallas and its sprawl represent the epitome of the Sunbelt growth thesis: build fast, sell fast, and let the population inflow handle the rest. The narrative of Dallas was that it was the safe, high-growth alternative to California. The reality is that Dallas is facing a triple threat of financial stressors that guarantee a crash far worse than its peers. First, the overdevelopment shock is staggering. The ratio of new apartment units delivered to actual population growth is at a multi-decade high, overwhelming the rental market and driving down demand for entry-level home purchases. Second, the property tax trap has been sprung. Texas relies heavily on property taxes, and the surging valuations of the boom years have now translated into crippling tax bills that have soared 30%, 40%, or even 50% for existing homeowners. This is a massive, annual financial drain that forces sales. Third, the investor exit is underway. Just like in Phoenix, the institutional money is quietly liquidating vast portfolios of single-family rentals across Plano, Frisco, and Kinney, selling properties en masse and driving new, devastatingly low comps. The homeowners who believed the Texas myth are now caught between rising tax payments they can't afford, stagnant equity, and a flood of new inventory. The $100,000 correction in Dallas isn't a correction. It's the inevitable collapse of a speculative empire built on endless, cheap land and optimistic debt. The market is drowning in supply and suffocating under its own tax burden, and the descent will be swift. Finally, in this section, we return to the East Coast, targeting a traditional powerhouse that has been undermined by stagnation and punishing overhead costs. This is number 3, Boston, Massachusetts. Boston was supposed to be protected by its concentration of generational wealth, elite universities, and the powerful biotech sector. The common wisdom was that the supply constraints and high demand from a wealthy, educated workforce would always keep prices aloft. This immunity has failed. Boston's collapse is a story of stagnation meets expense. While cities in the Sun Belt had excess demand, Boston's inventory problems are historic, but the demand has simply not been high enough to support the current, outrageous price levels. The most glaring factor here is the carrying cost crisis. For an older market, the cost of heating, insurance, property maintenance, and, critically, the average number of days a home sits on the market has doubled since the 2022 peak. When a $500,000 house spends 6 months waiting for a buyer, that carrying cost, mortgage, taxes, insurance, becomes a $20,000 to $30,000 annual loss for the seller. This financial burden forces sellers to eventually cut prices aggressively, and the data reflects this desperation. We are seeing properties selling for well below initial asking price, a shocking trend in a historically tight market. The $100,000 drop in Boston is the market finally acknowledging that its premium price is no longer supported by a dynamic, high-growth economy, but is instead weighed down by crushing legacy costs and a buyer pool paralyzed by uncertainty. The illusion of safety has been shattered, exposing the venerable New England market to the same volatility as the newest Sunbelt boomtowns. Section 4. The Final Catastrophe and the Inescapable Truth. We have reached the end of the line, the final countdown, and the absolute worst-case scenarios for American real estate. The cities that follow are not just correcting, they are fully collapsing under the weight of excessive speculation, disastrous overbuilding, and the complete withdrawal of the easy, cheap capital that sustained their growth for a decade. The $100,000 loss here is not a possibility, it is the minimum required sacrifice to cleanse these markets of their irrational exuberance. Starting our final segment at number 2, Austin, Texas. Austin was once the ultimate symbol of the new American economy, high-tech, high-growth, and infinitely cool. The narrative promised a vibrant, recession-proof tech hub. The reality is that Austin represents the most dramatic pandemic boom-bust cycle in the nation. Prices went up faster, further, and more furiously than almost any other major metro, driven by massive migration from the coasts and the endless optimism of venture capital. The city's fall is equally violent. Developers, responding to the boom, created a supply pipeline so vast it now dwarfs demand. Austin currently has more new apartments under construction per capita than almost any other metro, and these units are being delivered into a market where tech hiring has frozen and many pandemic transplants have either returned home or moved to cheaper parts of Texas. The affordability crisis here is terminal. Prices are completely untethered from local median income, requiring a collapse to make the market functional again. For the average homeowner in Austin, the $100,000 drop represents the erasure of all paper gains from the last 3 years, trapping a significant portion of the city's new residents in mortgages that exceed their home's value. Furthermore, the reliance on high-end discretionary income means that the downturn in the rental market is translating directly into homebuyer paralysis. Austin's financial pain is magnified by its psychological failure. It was the gold standard of growth, and its profound fall shatters the confidence of every similar Sunbelt market. The collapse of the Golden City serves as a chilling warning for the entire nation. If Austin can fail this hard, no one is safe. And now, we arrive at the market that embodies the complete systemic failure of speculation, oversupply, and the destruction of the luxury illusion. The city facing the most profound and catastrophic $100,000 loss by 2026 is number 1, Scottsdale, Arizona. Scottsdale is not collapsing because of a general housing downturn. It is collapsing because of a targeted, devastating short-term rental, STR, suicide. During the boom, Scottsdale became the mecca of Airbnb investors, particularly in luxury and second-home communities. Investors paid record prices, took on massive debt, and gambled that tourism and seasonal demand would never cease. The market is now brutally oversaturated. Thousands of new listings flooded the market at the same time that tourism softened and travelers shifted toward cheaper destinations. The result: occupancy rates have plummeted, and nightly rates have been slashed by 40% or more. For the investors who paid $800,000 to $1.2 million for a property, their mortgage payments, HOA fees, insurance, and maintenance costs now far exceed the paltry rental income they can generate. They are facing negative cash flow, losing thousands of dollars a month, and their only viable escape is to sell. But who will buy a luxury home that has proven incapable of generating income? This forced investor exodus is flooding the market with discounted inventory, properties that are appearing at 15 to 20% below peak comps. A $100,000 drop in Scottsdale is not a prediction. It is the inevitable outcome of a speculative bubble that burst with zero resistance. The city is a cautionary tale, A vivid demonstration of what happens when a market built entirely on discretionary luxury and short-term gambling is finally exposed to the discipline of demand. The pain here will be the most concentrated, the most immediate, and the most severe. This countdown, detailing the 10 markets set for a $100,000 drop, is more than just a list of cities. It is a roadmap to the new psychology of home ownership. The $100,000 correction has two profound, irreversible consequences that will fundamentally change the way millions of Americans view their biggest asset. The first consequence is the equity lock-in inversion. For homeowners who purchased between 2020 and 2022, a $100,000 loss of equity means they are now trapped. They are trapped not just by their low interest rate, but by the financial reality that selling would mean liquidating their entire down payment and walking away with nothing, or worse, having to bring cash to the closing table. This trapping effect paralyzes the market. It means fewer sellers can move freely, which leads to fewer options for buyers, and the entire transaction volume grinds to a halt. The market becomes a stagnant swamp of unwilling participants, where the only activity is driven by distress, foreclosures, divorces, or job losses, and those distress sales are what perpetually set the new, lower price comps, guaranteeing the cycle of loss continues. The promise of generational wealth has been replaced by the reality of generational debt. The second consequence is the end of housing as an investment vehicle. For decades, the collective American mindset treated homeownership as an automatic, risk-free savings account. The pandemic boom solidified this belief, convincing millions that they were brilliant investors simply for owning property. The $100,000 drop shatters this illusion. It introduces systemic risk back into the housing calculation. Future buyers, having witnessed the spectacular collapse of equity in these 10 markets, will enter the market with cynicism and extreme caution. They will demand massive price cuts to justify the risk, driving the median price even lower. The psychological shift alone is worth billions in lost valuation. The contrast is sharp. The dream was easy, guaranteed gains. The reality is the painful realization that you are holding in a liquid asset that can rapidly evaporate based on macroeconomic forces like the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy. This is the financial reckoning for an entire generation that mistook a boom for stable growth. We have presented the evidence: the convergence of interest rate shock, massive oversupply, corporate downsizing, and investor capitulation that guarantees the $100,000 loss in these 10 specific markets. From the tech capitals of Seattle and Austin to the retirement dreams of Phoenix and Scottsdale, the financial pain is not evenly distributed. It is targeted. Your competitor may talk about a national correction. We are showing you the localized catastrophe. Do not be blinded by outdated statistics or the self-serving optimism of those who profit from transactions. The time for waiting is over. The time for denial has passed. The $100,000 correction is not coming. It is already baked into the debt and the supply pipeline of these cities. If you live in one of these markets, you must audit your financial exposure immediately. If you are looking to buy, you must wait for the true bottom, the panic-induced fire sales that will follow this initial $100,000 drop. To survive the 2026 market reset, you need the unfiltered data, the raw truth, and the ongoing analysis that tracks these distressed markets in real time. Do not allow yourself to be the final victim of the greatest real estate equity correction in a generation. Hit the subscribe button now. We will continue to track the inevitable price cuts in these 10 cities and expose the next wave of markets about to fall into the $100,000 loss trap. The crisis is ongoing. Stay tuned.